Okay, so now that I talk about serialization, now we're going to see how we can actually solve this schema drift issue that we've seen before. And we'll need to look into Schema Registry, all right, which is a centralized place for us to put our data contracts and our schemas. So what exactly is the Schema Registry? So it's defined as a centralized service that stores and versions your schema. So say, for example, in our previous example, we had the events v1, events v2, and each one of them has its own schema. So we're going to actually upload this schema to a centralized place where both sides can communicate that centralized space to understand what is the current version, or what the schema looks like at which version. So it basically assigns a unique ID to each schema version and lets the client fetch it automatically when serializing or deserializing the messages. So we have this control by the ID. So why do we need it? At this point, I think you've already figured this out. But even after we choose a serialization format, the schema itself needs to be shared between the producer and the consumer, right? Because without it, each service stores its own schema file. So imagine you need to handle all of like separated schemas, and there's no clear communication between the services to what is the most up to date, at what scheme it's being used. And over time, different versions will drift across different teams or between different versions of the application and things like this. And say producers might serialize a version v2 while the consumers are still expecting a version v1, so that issue that we've seen before continues to happen. Okay, so if we look here in our diagram, now we are adding a new component, which is the schema registry here in between. So the producer is going to first register a schema into the schema registry. Then the schema ID is returned to the producer. Finally, the producer is going to cache that schema ID for reusing when it's sending more messages over and over again. And the message that now the producer is sending to the topic not only contains its body, but also it contains the schema ID associated with the message. So it's sent to the topic. The consumer then is going to read the bytes that are stored in the topic plus the schema ID that came from the schema registry, and then it's going to deserialize this message using the schema that was requested here in the schema registry. So the consumer requests the schema ID, and when it gets the bytes plus the schema ID, it says, all right, I'm using this one. This is the ID that the producer has assigned to the schema. Give me that, request the schema, and then deserialize it using that schema to successfully get the message transmitted. So this is how schema registry work. Just an overview for you. And we're going to see how we can implement, like how we can upload a schema to schema registry, both with the simple version and also we're going to build a wrapper for this. So it'll be good to start with our first end-to-end project after this.